In the town of Winston Falls, Kentucky, Pastor Gerald Daniels was a man who needed no introduction. Every Sunday morning, his voice echoed from the pulpit of Cedar Ridge Baptist Church, filling the pews with scripture, conviction, and comfort. He baptized babies, counseled broken marriages, visited the sick, and delivered the kind of sermons that made people cry without knowing why. For over 20 years, he was the heart of the community. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 2 daughters, led prayer circles, and organized potlucks that could feed the whole county. But on Wednesday afternoons, he left the sanctuary for a different kind of ministry, one not everyone in town knew about. Pastor Daniels spent his time behind bars, not as a prisoner, but as a preacher to inmates at the Monroe Correctional Facility just 14 miles down Route 16. He called it his calling within a calling. A way to reach lost souls who had wandered too far. And in the eyes of his congregation, it was admirable. Noble. Godly. But Pastor Daniels was living a second life, one carefully shielded by scripture and silence. In the summer of 2022, correctional officers found inmate Joshua Rowe, age 27, dead in his cell. No signs of forced entry. No witnesses. Just a lifeless body sprawled out beneath a bunk bed, with a bruised neck and a torn bedsheet wound tight around one hand. His death was ruled a homicide within hours. But who could have done it, and why? Joshua wasn't just another inmate. He wasn't just another face in a jumpsuit. He was the reason Pastor Daniels began missing Sunday services. He was the reason the pastor stopped wearing his wedding ring. And for those who read between the lines, he was the man who unraveled everything. What began as scripture became something else entirely, something secret, forbidden, and dangerous. And when the truth began to slip through the cracks, someone made sure Joshua Rowe would never speak again. What no one could answer was this: did Gerald Daniels kill the man he claimed to love, or did someone else uncover their truth first? Winston Falls wasn't the kind of town that made national news. Tucked away in a valley surrounded by farmland and pine, it was the kind of place where families passed down homes and recipes, and where people left their doors unlocked at night. Church was a given, gossip traveled faster than the mail, and everybody knew everybody else, or at least, they thought they did. So when word broke that a 27-year-old inmate had been found dead inside Monroe Correctional, the town barely flinched at first. Fights happened. People got hurt. Prison was prison. But within 24 hours, that casual indifference turned into confusion, and then suspicion. The inmate's name was Joshua Rowe. He was serving time for armed robbery, a mistake, he told others, that he never stopped regretting. But inside those walls, Joshua had built a reputation. He kept to himself, avoided gang politics, earned his GED, and even taught a literacy class for other inmates. He'd stayed out of trouble. His record was clean. And just 3 weeks before his scheduled parole hearing, he was found dead. There were no signs of struggle. No broken bones. No defensive wounds. The autopsy would later confirm, cause of death, manual strangulation. His hands showed bruising from a fight, but only on one side. The other? Strangely untouched. Whoever killed Joshua knew what they were doing, and did it up close. As investigators reviewed his file, one detail stood out: the last 3 phone calls Joshua made from prison had all gone to the same number. Not his mother. Not his sister. Not a lawyer. A burner phone registered to a church secretary at Cedar Ridge Baptist. That number, they would learn, had been used exclusively by one man, a man no one suspected, and no one could believe was even connected. Pastor Gerald Daniels. A pastor. A prisoner. A secret only 2 people truly understood. Until one of them turned up dead. Gerald Daniels was the cornerstone of his community. A man who carried the weight of his town's expectations with grace and humility, and who embodied the values of faith, family, and service. In Winston Falls, he was not just the pastor of Cedar Ridge Baptist Church, he was the embodiment of what it meant to live a righteous life. His family was his pride, his congregation his support. His was a life built on routine, on faith, and on the image of a man who had it all figured out. Pastor Daniels married Catherine in 1996. Their wedding was the stuff of small-town legends, high school sweethearts, young and in love, promising to stand by one another through thick and thin. Their 2 daughters, Lauren and Sarah, grew up in the church. The Daniels family was always together, whether it was holidays, Sunday services, or community potlucks. They were the picture-perfect family, the ones other families looked up to and admired. Gerald didn't just preach on Sundays, his role within the community extended far beyond the church walls. Week after week, he could be found at the local hospital, visiting the sick and the elderly, praying with families, offering comfort in their darkest hours. He organized charity drives for those in need and ran youth outreach programs. Every aspect of his life seemed to be dedicated to others. To his congregation, he was a leader who gave everything. A man of integrity. And yet, it was his work at Monroe Correctional Facility that made him stand out the most. Every Thursday afternoon, Pastor Daniels would drive the 14 miles down Route 16, straight to the prison gates. He often spoke of it with pride, his ministry of second chances, as he called it. You can't save a soul by just preaching at them, he'd say. You have to meet them where they are. And so, every week, he'd spend hours behind those walls, meeting with inmates. Offering guidance, prayer, and support to those trying to turn their lives around. He became a fixture at Monroe. His relationship with the correctional staff was nothing short of cordial, and the inmates respected him. He was known as someone who didn't judge, someone who truly believed in the power of redemption. His ability to connect with these men, who had been abandoned by society, earned him the respect of both the prisoners and the prison staff. He's a lifeline for them, many would say. He's doing God's work, bringing hope where there was none. What no one knew, what no one could have ever imagined, was that inside the prison walls, Pastor Daniels was living a double life. While he preached to others about redemption, he was secretly trapped in a relationship he couldn't control. He found himself drawn to Joshua Rowe, one of the younger inmates, just 27 years old at the time. Joshua had been in and out of trouble for years, but his life had taken a dramatic turn in prison. He started showing remorse for his past actions, earning his GED, working on self-improvement, and even teaching literacy to other inmates. At first, their connection seemed innocent enough. Joshua was a man trying to rebuild his life. He had nothing but time, and the pastor was someone who could offer him guidance. They talked about faith, about redemption, and about the mistakes they'd both made. But soon, their conversations shifted from the superficial to the personal. Pastor Daniels found himself confiding in Joshua, a man locked behind bars, in a way he had never confided in anyone else. Joshua, in turn, began opening up about his own struggles, his regrets, and his dreams of a fresh start after parole. It wasn't long before their bond deepened, and what started as spiritual mentorship transformed into something far more dangerous. Letters were exchanged, hidden between Bible pages, tucked inside envelopes marked with innocuous words. Private phone calls were made from secret cell phones, smuggled into the prison, their conversations growing more intimate, more fraught with desire. No one suspected anything. To the outside world, this was just another of Pastor Daniels' many ministries. He was doing God's work, after all. But within the confines of the prison chapel, behind the locked doors and the protective walls, a secret was growing. The pastor's feelings for Joshua became more than just admiration. He was emotionally entangled, and soon that connection escalated into something physical. Meetings were arranged under the guise of Bible study sessions or personal counseling. But it wasn't scripture they were sharing anymore, it was a forbidden intimacy, something neither of them fully understood, yet couldn't resist. The whispers were there, just beneath the surface. Joshua Rowe wasn't just another inmate. He was the catalyst for something that would shatter the pastor's carefully crafted life. And while Gerald Daniels preached about salvation and forgiveness to his congregation, he was hiding a secret that threatened everything: his marriage, his family, and the very foundation of his faith. He said he was saving souls. But in the process, he was losing his own. And Joshua Rowe wasn't the only one who would pay the price for it. Joshua Rowe wasn't always the man he appeared to be in prison. Before he became inmate number 37412, Joshua's life had been one of struggle, pain, and poor decisions that ultimately led him to a place he never expected to find himself. He was born and raised in a rough neighborhood, where opportunities were scarce and the streets were unforgiving. His early years were marked by hardship, and by the time he was 19, he had already been arrested twice for petty theft. But it wasn't until he was involved in a violent robbery that his life truly spiraled out of control. In 2010, Joshua was convicted of armed robbery after he and an accomplice attempted to rob a convenience store. The robbery went wrong, and in the chaos, a store clerk was injured. Joshua was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a sentence that felt like a death sentence to a young man who had no idea how to turn his life around. His early years behind bars were marked by anger and bitterness. He spent much of his time in solitary confinement, stewing over the unfairness of his life. He hated the system. He hated the prison guards. But most of all, he hated himself. But something changed during those long, solitary nights. Something that even he couldn't explain. Perhaps it was the quiet, or the time to think without distraction. Maybe it was the constant reminder of how he had failed himself, his family, and the people he had hurt. Whatever the reason, Joshua began to change. Slowly, methodically, and with a determination that surprised everyone, including himself. Over the next few years, Joshua threw himself into education. He earned his GED, started reading everything he could get his hands on, and took an interest in philosophy and art. He found solace in drawing, creating portraits of the people who had been lost to him over the years, and landscapes that he could only dream of seeing in person. He became known around Monroe as a quiet, introspective man, someone who didn't talk much but who had a rare depth about him. "He's not the same man he was when he came in," said one of the guards who worked closely with him. "He's changed. You can see it in his eyes. He doesn't have that anger anymore. He wants to make something of himself." Joshua's transformation was something rare in the world of corrections. In an environment where violence and hopelessness often reign, Joshua was a rare success story. He earned the respect of fellow inmates, not through intimidation, but through his dedication to change. He tutored younger prisoners in literacy, helped others earn their GEDs, and spent hours in the prison chapel reading scripture. He spoke of redemption and second chances, and he wasn't just talking about others, he was talking about himself. He dreamed of one day being paroled, of leaving the prison walls behind and starting over. But while many saw a reformed man, the truth was far more complex. Joshua's transformation, however genuine, didn't come without its own internal struggles. He was still haunted by the mistakes of his past, and even as he found peace in his newfound faith, there was a part of him that felt lost. Despite his best efforts, he knew that the world outside wouldn't see him the same way. To some, he was just another convict. A statistic, a man who had done his time and had no chance at redemption. But to those who truly knew him, especially the people he worked with inside the prison, Joshua Rowe was much more than that. He was a man who had taken the worst parts of himself and tried to turn them into something good. He was a man who had fought for his soul, every day, behind those prison walls. And to Pastor Gerald Daniels, Joshua was someone more than just a man seeking redemption. To the pastor, Joshua had become something else entirely. What began as spiritual guidance, as a minister's duty to save a troubled soul, turned into something far more complicated. Joshua Rowe wasn't just another inmate. He had become something that the pastor couldn't let go of. Inmate 37412 wasn't just a prisoner in the eyes of Pastor Daniels. He was a man with a future that had the potential to intertwine with the pastor's own. And that is where their story truly began. In a place designed to break people down, Pastor Gerald Daniels and inmate Joshua Rowe found something that neither of them expected. Something dangerous. What began as spiritual guidance, Pastor Daniels offering mentorship, slowly turned into something far more intimate, something neither could control. Their relationship didn't develop overnight. At first, they spoke about faith, redemption, and second chances. But over time, their conversations shifted. They began to open up about their personal struggles, Gerald about the weight of his responsibilities as a husband and father, and Joshua about his regrets and dreams for the future. It wasn't long before their connection deepened. Letters passed between them, once filled with scripture, now carrying hints of something else, something more personal, more emotional. The secrecy of their bond only intensified the feelings they had for one another. Soon, they began using contraband phones to communicate privately. Each call was a risk, each word exchanged a dangerous step further into territory neither of them had ever imagined entering. Despite their growing connection, Gerald struggled with the conflict inside himself. His faith, his family, his very identity as a man of God, he felt all of it unraveling. Joshua, too, found himself lost in the complexity of their relationship. What started as a mentor-inmate bond grew into something he couldn't fully grasp. The intimacy between them was undeniable, but it felt like a betrayal, of himself, of his faith, and of the very life he was trying to rebuild behind bars. Yet, the attraction remained, and the calls and letters continued. In the isolation of the prison chapel, their secret affair grew. What had once been a connection rooted in mentorship was now something far more complicated, a relationship that neither could control, yet both couldn't escape. On the morning of February 21, 2017, the quiet routine of Monroe Correctional Facility was shattered. Inmate 37412, Joshua Rowe, was found dead in his cell, strangled, his life violently taken in a way that suggested this wasn't a random act of violence. The cell was eerily undisturbed, with no signs of forced entry. His fellow inmates hadn't heard anything out of the ordinary the night before. There were no obvious clues, no weapons left behind, just a lifeless body and an unsettling silence. It didn't take long for the investigators to realize that this wasn't just another prison fight gone wrong. Joshua's death looked personal. Intimate. This wasn't a crime of chance, but one driven by something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. The way he was killed, the lack of struggle, the absence of evidence, all of it pointed to a deliberate, calculated act. As the prison authorities scrambled to secure the scene, it became clear that the investigation would be complicated. No one had seen anything, no one had heard anything. The cell was locked from the outside, and there were no signs of a break-in. The guards on duty couldn't recall anything unusual from the night before. But as investigators dug deeper, they started to find something odd, something that didn't quite fit. Among the prison's chapel logs, they found a note, unassuming at first, but significant in hindsight. It was a record of Pastor Daniel's frequent visits to the chapel, always at times when Joshua was either alone or in a private setting. The note wasn't directly incriminating, but it hinted at a deeper connection between the pastor and the inmate. It was the first clue that would lead them to ask a question no one was prepared for: could Pastor Daniels have been involved in Joshua's death? The investigation was quiet at first, but it was urgent. Joshua's death wasn't just another prison tragedy. It was something more, a carefully executed crime, and as authorities began to piece the puzzle together, they realized that someone close to Joshua had a motive. The only question that remained: who? As the investigation into Joshua Rowe's death continued, the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. The authorities knew they were dealing with more than just a random act of violence. This was something methodical, something personal. The question was, who was behind it? It wasn't long before the prison's investigators stumbled upon the first major lead. Hidden among Joshua's belongings were several letters that were addressed to someone outside the prison. The letters were from Pastor Gerald Daniels. At first glance, they seemed harmless, filled with religious encouragement and prayers for Joshua's redemption. But as the investigators dug deeper, they noticed something unsettling: the tone of the letters had changed over time. What began as a mentor offering guidance soon became more personal, more intimate, hinting at a bond far beyond what was expected in a pastoral relationship. Texts were also uncovered on a contraband phone Joshua had secretly kept hidden in his cell. The messages were exchanged between Joshua and the pastor over several months, some cryptic, others outright suggestive. Words of longing and emotional closeness were embedded in the messages, a stark contrast to the spiritual tone that Pastor Daniels had publicly maintained. The content of the texts painted a picture of a secret relationship, one that seemed to blur the lines between mentor and something far more intimate. But it wasn't just the letters and texts that raised suspicions. The surveillance footage from the night before Joshua's death also proved telling. The footage showed Pastor Daniels entering the prison chapel just after 9 p.m., a time when most of the inmates were supposed to be in their cells. The pastor remained inside for over an hour, and when he left, his behavior seemed unusually rushed, almost agitated. Yet, Pastor Daniels stuck to his story. He insisted that his relationship with Joshua had been entirely spiritual, that they had shared nothing more than religious conversations and a mutual desire for Joshua's redemption. He was a lost soul, seeking guidance, Daniels claimed. I was just doing my job as a pastor. I was trying to save him. But as investigators pieced together the timeline, things began to unravel. Pastor Daniels had claimed he'd been at home with his wife, Catherine, the night of the murder, a perfectly solid alibi. But when detectives began to question the staff and guards who had been on duty that night, the story started to shift. A guard, who had been working the night shift, came forward with a crucial detail. He had seen something odd in the chapel, something that contradicted Pastor Daniels' version of events. The guard recalled seeing the pastor leaving the chapel at 10:30 p.m., far later than he had originally claimed. What was even more troubling was that the guard had noticed the pastor's agitation as he walked past. He was muttering something under his breath, but the guard couldn't make out the words. What struck him, though, was the unmistakable look in Daniel's eyes, something in his gaze that suggested more than just the usual frustration or exhaustion. The investigation began to take a darker turn. The more evidence they uncovered, the more it seemed that Pastor Daniels had been hiding something far more than just his relationship with Joshua. Was it possible that the pastor had been involved in the murder, or had someone else, the inmate's hidden past, perhaps, played a role in his death? As the investigators pursued their leads, the theory that this was a crime of passion began to gain traction. The evidence pointed to the possibility that Joshua's death had been the result of a violent outburst, perhaps fueled by anger, jealousy, or betrayal. And at the center of it all was Pastor Daniels, a man whose double life had now become impossible to ignore. As the investigation into Joshua Rowe's death unfolded, the consequences of Pastor Gerald Daniels' secret life began to surface. What had once been a tight-knit, conservative town now found itself grappling with a truth that no one wanted to face. Churchgoers, who had once seen Pastor Daniels as a spiritual guide, began to whisper behind closed doors. For years, Gerald had been the trusted figure in their lives. Now, they had to come to terms with the shocking possibility that the pastor they admired had been hiding a deep, intimate secret. The town's conservative values made this revelation all the more explosive. The idea that the pastor had been involved in a romantic affair with an inmate went against everything the community believed in, especially in a place where LGBTQ issues were met with resistance and suspicion. The murder became secondary to the moral dilemma that now faced everyone. Pastor Daniels' family was also left reeling. His wife, Catherine, had been blindsided. The man she had married, the father of her children, was not the man she thought he was. The pain of betrayal was now compounded by the fact that her husband's secrets had torn apart not only their family but also their place in the community. The town was divided. Some rallied behind Pastor Daniels, sympathizing with his hidden struggle, while others condemned him for betraying the trust of both his family and his congregation. The community wasn't just mourning a murder, they were grappling with a truth they didn't want to acknowledge. As the public's judgment grew, so did the emotional fallout. The town, once united by shared faith, now stood fractured. For many, the revelations about Pastor Daniels had shaken the very foundation of everything they had believed in. Just when it seemed the investigation was winding down, a shocking new twist emerged. A second inmate, serving time at Monroe Correctional Facility, came forward with a startling claim. Pastor Gerald Daniels had asked for Joshua Rowe to be taken care of, to protect his reputation. The inmate, who had been in close contact with Daniels, described conversations in which the pastor expressed concern about his secret affair with Joshua becoming public knowledge. According to this inmate, Daniels had implied that Joshua's death would be the only way to keep his past hidden. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered even more disturbing evidence. Hidden phone logs from Joshua's contraband phone revealed something chilling. Someone else had entered Joshua's cell the night of the murder. The logs showed a call made from a number that wasn't tied to any of the usual suspects, and the timestamp matched up with the time of death. Was this a crime of passion, or was it a calculated act to silence Joshua forever? Could the pastor's darkest secret have driven him to orchestrate a murder to protect everything he had built? The theory now was that the killing wasn't just about a secret love affair, it was about survival. The investigation reached its climax when Pastor Gerald Daniels was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, and in some eyes, direct involvement in the death of Joshua Rowe. The evidence, including the secret texts and the testimony from the inmate, was damning. The trial was nothing short of dramatic. In a packed courtroom, the prosecution presented private messages between the pastor and Joshua, reading aloud the intimate and suggestive texts that had once been hidden in secrecy. The room grew tense as the details of the affair, and the pastor's alleged role in Joshua's murder, were laid bare. Witnesses testified about the emotional toll the crime had taken on Joshua's family, and the victim's mother spoke with trembling hands, her voice breaking as she described the son she had lost. The pain in her words was palpable, and it seemed to weigh heavily on the jury. But the defense stuck to their story, that Daniels had acted purely as a spiritual mentor, and any insinuation of guilt was an attempt to ruin a man of faith. However, the emotional impact of the evidence, combined with the testimony, was undeniable. And when the jury came back, the courtroom held its breath. Pastor Gerald Daniels was sentenced to life in prison, though some charges were reduced. His once proud reputation as a community leader was now shattered beyond repair. As the case came to a close, Joshua Rowe's story was re-examined. No longer just the inmate in a dangerous world, he was remembered as a man who had struggled to change, someone who found love in the most unexpected and tragic of places. His life, though short, was marked by a quiet hope that never fully had the chance to bloom. Former inmates who had known Joshua spoke of his transformation behind bars, how he had once been a violent man but had evolved, finding solace in art and in his own redemption. For them, his death represented not just a murder, but the loss of someone who had fought for something better. Meanwhile, Pastor Daniels' family was left to pick up the pieces of their broken lives. Catherine Daniels, forever marked by the scandal, spoke of a man she barely recognized. The man she had once loved was now behind bars, leaving her to face the reality of everything they had lost. 2 lives destroyed. One by love. One by fear. As the case closed, many were left wondering, did Pastor Daniels act out of desperation, driven by his need to keep his secret hidden? Or was there another hand at play, perhaps a jealous inmate, motivated by their own grievances? Theories swirled. Some believed Daniel's love for Joshua was powerful enough to lead him down a dark path, while others speculated that someone else, knowing the pastor's secret, might have had their own reasons for silencing the inmate. Was it love that led to murder? Or was this a secret someone else desperately wanted buried? The answers remain elusive, but one thing is certain, the story of Pastor Gerald Daniels and Joshua Rowe is one that will haunt the town of Monroe for years to come. Drop your theory in the comments. Do you think Pastor Daniels planned the murder, or was he being blackmailed into it? We want to hear what you think. If you found this case intriguing, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Tomorrow, we'll be back with another shocking crime that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. See you then.